So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I've been to this event for many years, and it's an incredible event, and it's wonderful to bring together people from all disciplines to speak about the issues of refugee resettlement in London, Ontario. I have to say that, I worked in Toronto for some years after I did my residency there, and really got interested by working in community health centers. And community health centers are this beautiful blend of medical services and community health services and social services. And the one experience that I had that really crystallized my decision to do more work in looking after immigrants and refugees was an experience with a group called the Immigrant Women's Health Center. And the Immigrant Women's Health Center was run out of the then Doctors Hospital. So if any of you remember the Doctors Hospital, it was sort of west downtown Toronto, no longer there. And what we did was we had a mobile home on the back of a truck, and we built an exam room into that mobile home. So it had an examining room table, it had examining equipment, and we contracted in the fashion district in Toronto, which is sort of Spadina and Bathurst area, with a number of factories where immigrant women worked. And what we did was we contracted with employers to be able to go in and allow women who didn't attend to their healthcare needs because they were busy working 2 or 3 jobs and looking after their families in a new country. They basically didn't have time to look after their preventive or even their intercurrent health care. So this was time that they were allowed that was paid time, and we would go to a factory and we would take somebody who spoke one language each day, and we would go into, and these were factories that no longer exist, I think, like Mr. Leonard. So they were factories that produced really high-end clothing for kind of the wealthy Canadian women. So we would go in with somebody who spoke, for example, Vietnamese, a community worker, and she would give a talk to the women in the factory about preventive care, about pap smears, about mammograms. And then the women had the opportunity, if they chose, to come down to the mobile home, and we then examined them and offered pap smears, blood pressure checks, setting up for mammograms. And what really astonished me, I knew from back then in medical school, and I'm sure Niket, who's the medical student who's here with me today, things haven't changed too much in 30 years. We struggle to get determinants of health into the curriculum. We struggle to get attention to cross-cultural competency into the curriculum. We now do have a couple of lectures in population health in first year, so we've made some headway there. So, I'm certainly aware that there were barriers to achieving health for people who had newly arrived into the country, or who were marginalized by language barriers or by cultural barriers. But what really struck me in that project was how vast that divide was. So, we pride ourselves in Canada in having great health outcomes. We still lag behind the Scandinavian countries, which are sort of the head of the pack in the whole world at achieving good outcomes. But for me to see a woman, for example, who had a blood pressure that was unspeakably high and hadn't seen a doctor for 10 years, or to see a woman who had obvious cervical cancer when I examined her, so not even the cells that we see on microscope when we send off a pap smear, but visible to the naked eye cervical cancer in a country like Canada, that really, really astonished me. We've made huge headway, and some of my partners are here who worked on the Cancer Care Ontario work to help in the Southwest region to reach out to new refugees and immigrants and to be able to minimize that health disparity when it comes to cancer screening. So we've made strides, but we still see a huge disparity. So mental health, and that's where, I think in particular when we compare immigrants and refugees, immigrants have something called the healthy immigrant effect, because those who choose to come are often the cream of the crop, who have made, people who can actually pull their lives together and decide to get a better life. we've made a decision on a humanitarian basis as a country that we will accept refugees regardless of health parameters, and that we will accept them in order to help them resettle from areas of conflict and war. So refugees come with a number of mental health issues, and I think what's really important in this dialogue is there can be a very fine line between attending to mental health needs and xenophobia. So it's really important that we not say, there are mental health problems in refugees, because that can provide armamentarium for the kind of the naysayers in the acceptance of refugees. At the same time, we do need to recognize that there are a number of pre-migration, migration, and post-migration factors that lead to mental health problems in refugees. Pre-migration factors, I think we're all aware, are things like trauma, war, the witnessing of violence. In this beautiful video that we just saw of refugee youth describing their experiences, we know from the literature that youth have many risk factors for mental health, including the number of violent acts they've seen, the amount of time they've spent in a war-torn area, the age, so the older the age they are when they arrive, the more they've witnessed and the more likely they are to have mental health outcomes. And then migration itself carries a host of risk factors, including what happens on the way, the third country they live in on the way here, whether they've lived in a camp. Living in a camp is certainly a huge risk factor for mental health issues. And then what makes me the most sad are the post-migration experiences, something that we sometimes call secondary trauma. And unfortunately, that's the thing we can mitigate, and that is that post-migration isolation, disillusionment, and sadly racism often add to that traumatic experience. We often pay attention to depression and disillusionment and post-traumatic stress disorder, but the literature is showing more and more, and in a recent article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, that even things like psychosis can be impacted by the experience of being a refugee. So we really do need to pay attention to these factors. And one of the things that we set out to do with the Newcomer Health Project, which is the project that's a collaboration between the Intercommunity Health Centre, the medical school, and the Cross-Cultural Learner Centre, is to meet new refugees who arrived, government-assisted refugees who arrive, and do health screening. And we do ask them if they're wanting to talk about trauma and about their mental health. We ask them, or at least plant the seed, that it's okay in the context of a medical interview to talk about mental health experiences. And I think that we try to be the welcoming committee from the medical side. Often in many countries, people don't have permission in a primary care setting to talk about mental health. So opening that door to be able to talk, I think, is the first step. So thank you so much for your attention.